The sun was just dipping behind the jagged ridges of the frontier when John Mercer leaned against the weathered post of his porch, hat tilted low, eyes staring out over the endless sweep of prairie grass. His ranch stretched for miles. Dry fences, scattered cattle, a few stubborn horses, and the creak of wind through broken boards. It was all he had left. To most, the land seemed lifeless, but to John, it was both his prison and his salvation. Years of toil and solitude had carved deep lines into his face. The townfolk whispered about him, the quiet rancher, they called him, some with suspicion, others with pity. He had arrived years ago, buying land no one else wanted, and built his homestead with his own two hands. Yet he kept mostly to himself, riding into town only when necessary for supplies. He spoke little, smiled less, and carried the air of a man who had lost more than he cared to tell. The truth was, John Mercer's life was marked by silence and shadow. His wife had died years back, taken by fever, and his young daughter followed soon after. Grief had driven him far from kin and comfort, burying him in the wilderness where no one asked questions. The ranch became his world, his refuge from memories, too sharp to bear. But with each season, the silence grew heavier. Some nights, it pressed against his chest so tightly that he swore the house itself might collapse beneath the weight of his loneliness. Neighbors avoided him, not out of cruelty, but because he gave them no reason to draw near. At gatherings, in town, he was the man standing at the edges, hat in hand, never joining in, never laughing. Children whispered tales about him being half wild, more ghost than man. He heard their stories in passing, but he never corrected them. In a way, it was easier that way. Better to be feared or forgotten than pitied. Still, for all his distance, there was a goodness buried in John's heart. He mended broken tools for struggling farmers without ever charging a coin. He left small bundles of meat on a widow's porch when harsh winters threatened. He gave without recognition, never admitting to kindness, and always retreating before gratitude could follow. Compassion was the only part of his soul he hadn't managed to bury, though he tried. That evening, as the sky flamed with streaks of crimson and gold, John sat alone with a tin cup of coffee, listening to the lowing of cattle and the howl of wolves in the far distance. His hands, rough from years of rope and reins, tightened around the cup. Life, he thought, was nothing more than survival. Day after day, work after work, until the body gave out. He had stopped expecting more, yet even in the quiet, something stirred inside him, a longing he could not name. He often caught himself imagining a voice calling from inside the empty house, a laugh echoing through the halls, or small feet pattering across wooden floors. But when he opened the door, only silence greeted him. He shook it off as foolishness. But deep down, he knew he was waiting for something, someone, though he could not say who. On nights like these, when dusk seemed to swallow the land whole, he felt it strongest. The wind carried whispers across the plains, as though the earth itself were keeping secrets. John had lived long enough to know that life had a way of testing men when they least expected it. Still, he had no notion that his trial was already on its way, that beyond the horizon fate was moving swiftly toward him. The prairie was wide, but not empty. Shadows were stirring. Somewhere in the dense woods along the creek, a small figure was running for his life. Bare feet tore across roots and stones, breath coming in frantic gasps, eyes wild with fear. The boy did not know where he was headed, only that he must escape. And the path of his desperate flight would soon lead him to the rancher's porch, to the man who believed his days of meaning had long since passed. That night, John Mercer would hear a cry in the darkness, one that would shatter the silence of his lonely world and set into motion a story he never could have imagined. The prairie had gone still by the time the moon rose high, silvering the grasslands in a pale glow. John Mercer was just dousing the lantern in his cabin when the sound came. At first it was faint. So faint he thought it no more than the cry of a night bird or the restless wind whistling through the cracks of his barn. But then it came again, sharp, trembling, human. He froze, hand hovering over the lantern wick. His instincts, honed from years of living alone, told him to stay quiet, to listen. Out here, far from the safety of town, any sound in the night could mean danger. Bandits, drifters, or worse, soldiers who had been drinking too much whiskey and looking for trouble. He had learned long ago that the prairie's silence hid many threats. The cry came a third time, unmistakable now. It was a child's voice, fragile and frightened. John's jaw tightened. He reached for the rifle propped near the door, cradling it in his hands as he stepped out into the night. The air was cool, scented with sage and dust, and the silence pressed heavy after that echo of distress. "Who's there?" His voice was steady but low, carrying just far enough to cut through the hush. No answer came, only the soft rustle of movement near the tree line where the moonlight barely touched. John's boots crunched softly on the dirt as he moved toward the sound. His eyes, trained by years of ranch life, caught the faintest flicker of motion. A small figure crouched low, trembling, half hidden in the shadows. He raised the rifle slightly, not in threat, but in readiness. "Come on out," he said, firm but not unkind. "I won't hurt you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the figure emerged. It was a boy, no older than 9, thin as a reed, barefoot, his clothes torn and stained with dirt. His dark eyes glistened with fear as he glanced back, toward the woods, as though expecting something, or someone, to appear from the darkness. John lowered the rifle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered under his breath. This was no runaway settler's child. The boy's long black hair, braided and loose in places, his woven tunic, and the patterns painted faintly on his skin, told John what he already suspected. The child was native. The rancher's heart clenched. He knew the risks at once. Tensions between settlers and natives had been simmering for months. Skirmishes, raids, reprisals, each side blamed the other. And now here stood a native boy on his land, frightened and alone. To shelter him would be seen as betrayal by townsfolk and soldiers alike. But then the boy's lips quivered, and his voice broke the night air. "Please, hide me." Something inside John stirred, a memory flashing like a knife in the dark. His own daughter, once crying for comfort in the fever's grip, her hand clinging weakly to his. He had been powerless then. He would not be powerless now. "Easy, son," John said gently, setting the rifle aside. "Ain't no harm gonna come to you here." He motioned the boy toward the barn, the only place that might offer shelter without drawing too many eyes. The boy hesitated, then darted inside, moving with the quickness of a wild creature desperate for safety. John followed, closing the door behind them. Inside, the smell of hay and horses filled the air. John lit a small lantern, its glow revealing the boy's trembling hands and scraped knees. He offered a blanket and a tin cup of water. The boy drank greedily, eyes never leaving John's face. "Name's Mercer," John said, crouching so he wouldn't tower over him. "You got a name, boy?" The child hesitated, then whispered, "Tahu." "Tahu?" John repeated, nodding. "All right. You'll stay here tonight. No one'll find you." Tahu's shoulders sagged in relief, but his eyes still darted to the shadows. Clearly, whoever or whatever he was running from still haunted him. John settled onto a hay bale, rifle across his knees, keeping watch as the boy curled beneath the blanket. Sleep tugged at Tahu quickly. He was exhausted. But John stayed alert, every creak and rustle outside sharpening his senses. For the first time in years, his house did not feel so empty. For the first time in years, he was no longer alone, and, as the boy drifted into uneasy sleep, John Mercer made a silent vow. Whatever danger stalked this child, it would have to go through him first. Morning broke slowly across the prairie, painting the land in muted streaks of pink and gold. John Mercer was already awake, sitting by the barn door with his rifle laid across his knees. He hadn't slept. His ears had stayed sharp through the night, tuned to every crack of branch and whisper of wind, waiting for the sound of pursuit. Inside the barn, the boy Tahu stirred beneath the blanket John had given him. When his eyes fluttered open, wide and uncertain, he looked around as though he had woken in a dream he didn't trust. John turned his head. "You're safe," he said simply, his voice carrying the steady calm of a man used to speaking only when necessary. No one came in the night. For a moment, the boy didn't answer. He only clutched the blanket tighter, his thin arms trembling. Then, in halting words, he whispered, "They chased me." His English was broken, but clear enough. John's stomach tightened. He didn't press the child. Not yet. The fear in Tahu's eyes told him all he needed for now. Something terrible had driven him out into the night, and whatever it was, it might still be near. John rose, stiff from the cold, night air, and fetched a hunk of bread and a strip of dried venison from his cabin. He returned and handed it to the boy, who ate with the quiet desperation of someone who hadn't known a full meal in days. John watched in silence, a swirl of thoughts gnawing at him. He knew the danger he had taken on the moment he let the boy cross his threshold. Shelter was not just kindness. It was a choice, a dangerous one. If word got out that John Mercer was harboring a native child, the settlers in town would brand him a traitor. Some would demand the boy be turned over to the soldiers. Others might take matters into their own hands, and soldiers themselves, rough men hardened by war and whiskey, would show no mercy. To them, the boy was not a child, but an enemy. No matter how innocent his eyes looked. John chewed the inside of his cheek as he considered it. He had lived quietly for years, deliberately keeping his head down, avoiding trouble. Trouble had a way of finding a man when he stood out. But now, trouble had come to him anyway. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees, and spoke, softly. "Tahu, you got family? People who are looking for you?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. "My father, Chief." His voice cracked at the word. "Bad men came. Fire, horses. My mother, gone." His lips trembled. John's throat tightened. He looked away, staring at the dust motes floating in the lantern light. He had seen violence before. Ranches burned, families torn apart in the name of land and revenge. But to hear it in the broken words of a child was different. It was a knife twisted deep. Tahu's eyes locked on his, pleading though no words followed. And in that moment, John knew he had no real choice. He could not hand the boy over. He could not cast him back into the wild. Whatever the cost, he would protect him. John stood, squaring his shoulders. "All right, then," he said, voice firm, final. "You stay here till we figure this out. No one's taking you from me." Tahu's small hands clutched the blanket tighter, and for the first time, a flicker of relief softened his face. But even as John made that promise, he knew the path ahead was dangerous. The boy's presence was a secret too fragile to keep for long. The settlers in town had sharp eyes and sharper tongues, and if soldiers caught wind of it, there would be no end to the trouble. John fetched water from the well, set it near the boy, then pulled open the barn door to look out across the land. The morning sun glinted off the fields, calm and quiet for now, but he could feel the storm gathering beyond the horizon. For a man who had tried so hard to avoid the world's battles, John Mercer had just stepped into one. He had chosen to shelter a hunted child. And with that choice, his life, and perhaps the lives of many, would never be the same again. The days that followed were a test of patience, silence, and trust. John Mercer had given Tahu a corner in the barn, lining it with fresh hay and a few blankets. He brought food in small portions, bread, beans, strips of smoked venison, sometimes an apple or two from his dwindling supply. Each time, the boy accepted it cautiously, as though still unsure whether this stranger meant him harm. At first, Tahu barely spoke. His dark eyes tracked John's every move, wary and sharp, like a wild creature waiting for a trap to spring. He flinched at sudden noises, the slam of the barn door, the bray of a mule, even the crack of wood in the fireplace when John lit it at night. Whatever he had seen before he came running to John's ranch had carved fear deep into his small frame. John knew better than to press him. He had learned long ago that trust wasn't given. It was earned, slow as the rising of dawn. So he let the boy set the pace. He went about his chores as usual, fixing fences, tending cattle, mending tools, but he always made a point of returning to the barn, checking on Tahu, speaking softly even when the boy gave no reply. One morning, as John hauled a bucket of water to the barn, he found Tahu crouched by the stall, running his hand gently along, the muzzle of a chestnut mare. The horse nickered softly, nudging the boy's palm. John paused, leaning against the doorframe, watching. For the first time, Tahu's face softened, not in fear, but in wonder. "She likes you," John said quietly. Tahu jerked his hand back, startled, but the mare snorted as if in protest. Slowly, cautiously, the boy touched the horse again, glancing at John as if seeking permission. John gave a small nod. "Her name's Willow. She don't take to many, but she's made up her mind about you." For a fleeting moment, a smile tugged at Tahu's lips. It was faint, almost hidden, but it lit his face in a way John hadn't seen before. Something inside John stirred, a warmth he hadn't felt since his daughter was alive. Over the next days, Tahu grew bolder. He began mimicking John's chores, dragging small bundles of hay to the stall, fetching water with a determination that outweighed his size. John tried to wave him off at first, but the boy insisted with a quiet strength. Work, John realized, was his way of belonging. One evening, as they sat by the fire in John's cabin, John offered the boy a piece of cornbread. Tahu accepted, chewing thoughtfully before speaking in his halting English. "You alone?" he asked, gesturing toward the empty cabin. John stared into the flames for a long while before answering. "Yes, been that way for some time." His voice was steady, but beneath it lay the weight of years of silence. Tahu lowered his gaze. "Me too," he whispered. The words settled heavy between them. John looked at the boy, and for the first time, he saw not just fear, but the reflection of his own loneliness staring back at him. A child torn from his family, a man torn from his. Different worlds, yet bound by the same ache. John reached across the small table and placed his rough hand over Tahu's small one. "Not anymore," he said. "You ain't alone here." The boy blinked, his lips parting as though he wanted to say more, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, his shoulders easing for the first time since he had arrived. From that night on, something shifted. Tahu began to speak more, small words, fragments of stories about his people, about his father, who he called a chief. He spoke of running through the forest with friends, of songs sung around fires, of laughter that echoed beneath the stars. But whenever he reached the memory of fire and screams, his words faltered, and John let the silence stand. The bond between them grew, forged not in grand gestures but in quiet moments. Shared meals, mended fences, the simple rhythm of two lives, brushing against one another. John found himself talking more than he had in years, telling stories of his youth, of the wild horses he once broke, of the rivers he fished. The boy listened intently, eyes wide, as though these small tales were treasures, and in return, Tahu gave John something he hadn't known he needed: purpose. Yet beneath this fragile bond, John knew the truth lingered like a storm on the horizon. The boy's people would be searching. Soldiers, too. And the settlers in town, if they caught wind of the child's presence, their whispers could turn to danger quickly. But John set his jaw and made a silent vow. Come what may, he would protect the boy. For in saving Tahu, he was saving a part of himself he thought long dead, the part that still believed in love and duty and family. The bond between John and Tahu deepened with each passing day, but bonds alone could not keep the outside world at bay. Trouble, as John feared, was already stirring in town. It began with small murmurs. Folks at the general store noticed John, making more frequent trips than usual, picking up extra flour, beans, and cloth. Odd for a man who lives alone, one woman whispered as she filled her basket. What's he need all that food for? Another muttered that John had been seen heading back at dusk with his wagon loaded heavier than usual. In a town where secrets were currency, it didn't take long for speculation to spread. One evening, John rode into town for supplies. The air was thick with summer dust, wagons rattling along the dirt road, dogs barking at strays. As he tied his horse outside the store, he felt it, eyes watching him, lingering too long. He was used to being the subject of gossip, but this felt sharper, more pointed. Inside, Mr. Caldwell, the storekeeper, greeted him with his usual tight-lipped nod. But behind him, two ranch hands leaned against the counter, lowering their voices, just enough for John to catch snippets. Swear I heard a kid's voice out near his place? Could be he's hiding something? You know how he keeps to himself. Never did trust a man like that. John kept his face still, his jaw tight. He collected his goods without a word, paid in cash, and walked out. But as he loaded his supplies onto the wagon, he caught sight of Sheriff Mallory across the street, arms folded, eyes squinting in his direction. The sheriff was a hard man, loyal to the settlers, quick to act if he smelled trouble. John felt the weight of that gaze like a noose tightening. On the ride home, the prairie stretched wide and empty, yet John could not shake the unease pressing down on him. Every fence post seemed to hold a shadow, every distant rider a threat. The whispers in town were spreading. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking. That evening, Tahu met him at the barn, carrying a bucket of water with both hands. "You worried?" the boy said softly, noticing the strain in John's eyes. John ruffled his hair gently, forcing a small smile. "Just tired, son. Nothing for you to fret on." But inside, his thoughts churned. He had brought this boy into his life, promised him safety, yet danger was closing in from all sides. Over supper, John debated telling Tahu the truth, that the townsfolk might come, that soldiers could appear any day. But the boy was already carrying more fear than any child should. Instead, John watched him eat quietly, the firelight softening his small features, and resolved to bear the burden himself. The next morning, the threat arrived at his doorstep. A wagon rattled up the dirt path, stopping near the gate. Dust rose, and 3 men climbed down. Neighbors, men John had nodded to at town gatherings, but never called friends. Their faces were hard, suspicion etched deep. "Mercer," one called, striding up with the swagger of someone who believed he had the right to pry. "We've been hearing things. Folks say there's a kid on your land." John leaned against the porch rail, rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. His voice was calm, but firm. "Don't know what you've been hearing, but there's no child here." The men exchanged glances. One stepped closer, boots grinding the dirt. "Then you won't mind if we take a look around." John's eyes hardened. "You'll do no such thing. This is my land. You want to search it? You'll need the sheriff and a warrant in hand. Till then, you turn that wagon around. The stand off." Hung heavy in the air, tension crackling like dry brush before a fire. The men weren't used to being defied, but John Mercer wasn't a man to be pushed. After a long, taut silence, they spat in the dust, muttered curses, and climbed back into their wagon. But as they rode off, John knew this wasn't over. They would talk, and soon more would come. That night, as Tahu slept in the barn, John sat. On the porch, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon. He had chosen this path the night he took the boy in. Now the consequences were coming to meet him, and in the quiet of the prairie, he whispered to himself, "Let 'em come." The morning sun hung low, casting long shadows across the ranch. John Mercer stood at the fence line, repairing a sagging post when the sound of hooves reached his ears. Not one rider, not two, several. The rhythm of horses on packed dirt carried with it the promise of trouble. He straightened slowly, dusting off his hands. From the rise beyond the creek came a wagon, followed by 4 mounted men. Their faces were set hard, their movements deliberate. At the center rode Sheriff Mallory, his wide-brimmed hat low, his eyes sharp as rifle barrels. John's gut tightened. This was the moment he had been expecting ever since the whispers started in town. The men reined in near the porch, dust curling. Around their horses' legs, the sheriff swung down from his saddle, boots crunching on the dry earth. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a mustache that twitched when he spoke. "Morning, Mercer," Mallory said, his voice steady, practiced, carrying the weight of law, or at least the settler's version of it. John gave a small nod. "Sheriff, you know why we're here." Mallory's gaze swept over the barn, the corral, the cabin windows. "There've been reports. Folks say you've got a boy on this property, a native boy." John didn't flinch. "And if I did?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Then I'd be obliged to take him. Can't have you harboring one of them. Too dangerous. Might bring his kin down on all of us." Behind Mallory, one of the ranch hands spat in the dirt. "Heard the savages burned a settlement last week. Kid like that don't deserve no shelter. He's the enemy." John's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed the stock of his rifle leaning against the fence. He didn't raise it, not yet, but the message was clear. He's no enemy. He's a child, scared and alone. "Be that as it may," Mallory said, voice cooling. "The law don't make exceptions. Hand him over and—" "This ends here." Silence fell, broken only by the restless shifting of horses. John's eyes flicked toward the barn, where he knew Tahu was watching from a crack in the wood. The boy's small, fearful face flashed in his mind. The trust he had begun to show, the bond they had forged. To hand him over now would be to betray not just the boy, but the man John himself was trying to be again. He took a step closer, his voice low but iron-strong. "Sheriff, you've known me near 10 years. I've never asked a thing of this town. I've kept to myself, worked my land, harmed no one. But I'll be damned if I hand over a child to the likes of you. Not today, not ever." The men bristled, hands drifting toward their guns. The air grew sharp, heavy, as though the prairie itself was holding its breath. Mallory studied him, weighing the moment. He wasn't a fool. He knew Mercer's reputation. A quiet man, yes, but one with steel in him, a man who didn't bluff. Finally, the sheriff stepped back, his voice dropping into warning. "You're making a grave mistake, Mercer. You think? You can protect him, but you can't protect yourself from what's coming. You side with them, you turn your back on us. Don't expect no sympathy when the storm hits." John's eyes never wavered. "Then let it hit." A tense silence lingered before Mallory swung back into his saddle. He gave a sharp tug on the reins, and the group turned, dust rising in their wake as they rode off toward town. John watched, until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. His heart pounded, but his resolve was firm. He turned toward the barn. Tahu was waiting at the door, eyes wide, small hands clenched at his sides. John crouched, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "They'll be back," John said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "But don't you worry. I gave you my word. You're safe here. Long as I draw breath, nobody's taking you." The boy nodded slowly, trust shining through his fear. And in that moment, John knew the line had been drawn. He was no longer a man simply hiding a child. He was standing against the tide of his own people, prepared to fight if he must. The prairie lay still in the days that followed. But John Mercer knew stillness could be deceiving. He had seen the looks in town, heard the venom in the voices of his neighbors, felt the weight of the sheriff's warning. Trouble was building, like thunder on the horizon. He kept his rifle close and his horse saddled, never straying far from the ranch. Tahu sensed it too. The boy was quieter than ever, his dark eyes flicking to every sound beyond the barn walls. At night, he sometimes woke in a start, whispering words in his native tongue that John couldn't understand, though he knew the sound of fear when he heard it. Each time, John sat beside him, steady and silent, until the boy's breathing calmed. But on the fourth morning, everything changed. John was out by the well, hauling water, when a low, rhythmic sound drifted across the open land. At first it was faint, little more than a distant hum. But then it grew, deep, resonant, like the beating of the earth's own heart. Drums. John froze, the bucket slipping from his hand and splashing at his boots. His eyes lifted to the far horizon. There, in the morning haze, a dark line shimmered, growing larger with each passing moment. Horses, riders. The air quivered with the sound of hooves, the thrum of leather, the piercing cries of warriors. Tahu burst from the barn, his eyes wide, not with fear this time, but with recognition. "My people!" he cried, his voice breaking as he ran toward the fence. John's breath caught. Never in his life had he seen such a sight. Across the plain, the line of riders stretched wide, hundreds of them, their horses adorned with feathers and paint, their faces fierce beneath the sun. Spears gleamed, bows curved in readiness, rifles slung across strong backs. 500. Warriors rode as one, a tide of power and purpose. They approached swiftly, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground beneath John's boots. He steadied himself, heart hammering. He knew enough of frontier life to understand how this could end. If they saw him as the enemy, his ranch would be ash before the sun reached its peak. The riders slowed as they neared, circling the ranch in a great arc, enclosing it with sheer force of numbers. Dust rose, cloaking the air. At their center rode a man tall and broad, his bearing commanding. His chest was marked with painted symbols of leadership, his hair braided with eagle feathers. His eyes, sharp as flint, fixed first on Tahu, then on John. Tahu scrambled over the fence and ran to him, tears streaming down his face. The chief leaned down from his horse, scooping the boy into his arms, holding him tight against his chest. For a long moment, nothing else mattered. The child was safe, returned. Warriors around them raised their voices in cries that split the sky, a chorus of triumph and relief. John stood still, his rifle slung but ready. His throat was dry, his palms damp. He had given the boy shelter, yes, but what would that mean? To this chief and his people, gratitude or vengeance for a child lost among settlers? The chief rode forward slowly, his warriors parting around him. He stopped his horse just a few feet from John, the dust settling between them. Tahu clung to his father's neck, then pointed toward John. "He saved me," the boy said, voice urgent. "He gave me food. He hid me. He made me safe." The chief studied John for a long, silent moment. His gaze was unreadable but heavy with the weight of a decision. Then, slowly, he dismounted, setting Tahu gently on the ground. He stepped forward, eyes never leaving John's. Finally, he placed a hand over his chest, then extended it outward, a gesture of honor. His voice was deep, carrying for all his people to hear. "You sheltered my son," he said in measured English. "For this, you have sheltered my people. We do not forget." Behind him, 500 warriors struck their spears and rifles against the earth in unison, the sound rolling. Like thunder across the prairie, it was not the sound of war. It was the sound of gratitude. John exhaled, the tension leaving his body. For the first time in many years, he bowed his head, not in fear, but in respect. The dust had hardly settled when silence fell over the ranch. 500 warriors stood poised around John Mercer's homestead, the sun glinting off feathers, steel, and painted hides. The air was thick with reverence, not hostility. John, who had braced himself for fire and fury, found instead a weighty calm, like the moment before rain breaks from a heavy sky. The chief, tall and formidable, lowered his hand after the warrior's thunderous salute. His eyes softened as he looked at John, and though his face bore the lines of battles fought and losses endured, there was gratitude etched deep into his features. "You gave your roof and your bread," the chief said. "You risked the anger of your own people. My son lives because of your courage." His words carried far, so every warrior heard them. John shifted on his boots, uneasy under the weight of so many eyes. He wasn't a man who sought glory. He had acted on instinct, not for recognition. "Any man with a heart would have done the same," he muttered, though his voice caught. The boy was scared. "I couldn't just leave him." The chief studied him, then gave a nod of respect. "Many men speak of hearts. Few act with them." At that, several warriors dismounted, approaching John in solemn formation. Each carried something, bundles wrapped in leather, carved ornaments, woven blankets rich with color. They laid these gifts at his feet, creating a pile that grew with each step. Beads glimmered in the sunlight, feathers stirred in the wind, and hand-wrought tools of bone and iron gleamed with craftsmanship. John took a step back, bewildered. I don't need gifts." The chief lifted his hand, halting John's protest. "These are not payment. These are signs. When my people see them, they will know your name. They will know the rancher who protected a child when others would not." The warriors who had set the gifts down, then each touched a hand to their chest before turning back, their faces solemn. John felt his throat tighten. In all his years of living out on this land, marked as an outsider by townsfolk, burdened by whispers of mistrust, he had never known honor like this. Then came the moment that shook him deeper still. The chief raised his voice, calling something in his native tongue. At once, the warriors around the ranch let out a long, unified cry. It was not a cry of war, but a chant, a song of gratitude. Their voices blended with the pounding of drums, and the sound rose to the sky, echoing over the plains like a hymn. Tahu stood near John, his small hand brushing against John's rough palm. "They honor you," the boy whispered. "They honor your spirit." John felt his chest tighten. He had lived so long carrying the weight of isolation that he almost didn't know how to bear this kind of recognition. His eyes burned, though. He blinked hard to steady himself. When the chant subsided, the chief stepped forward once more. He reached into the pouch at his side and withdrew something wrapped in deerskin. Unfolding it, he revealed a necklace, a cord strung with polished beads and a single eagle feather. He lifted it high so all could see. "In our way," the chief said, "this feather is not given lightly. It is a mark of respect, of courage, of honor. Today, I place it upon you, John Mercer." Before John could protest, the chief slipped, the cord around his neck. The feather rested against his chest, light yet heavy with meaning. Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathered warriors. John stood frozen, unsure how to respond. He finally removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I ain't never been called an honorable man," he said softly, "but I'll wear this with pride. Not for myself, but because of that boy." He glanced at Tahu, who smiled through wet eyes. The chief laid a strong hand on John's shoulder. "From this day, your ranch is under our protection. Should harm come to you 500 warriors will stand at your side." John swallowed hard. Protection, brotherhood, gratitude, all for doing what his heart had compelled him to do. As the warriors mounted again, the drums carried their song into the distance. John remained standing where they left him, the eagle, feather resting over his heart, the boy's small hand still clasped in his. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. In the days that followed the great gathering, John Mercer's ranch felt different. The land, once haunted by silence and the creak of lonely wind, now carried the memory of 500 warriors whose presence had left an invisible mark on the soil. Each morning when John stepped outside, he found himself glancing at the eagle feather resting against his chest, still struggling to believe it hung there by right. The townsfolk, too, noticed the change. Whispers spread fast, as they always did. Some claimed the natives had come to punish him, yet left without bloodshed. Others swore he had struck some secret bargain. But those who saw the feather around his neck could not deny that it meant something far greater than fear. When John rode into town for supplies, he felt the stares more than ever, but now there was hesitation in them, even a trace of respect. Men who had once spat at his boots now moved aside. A few even tipped their hats. No one dared question him aloud, not after seeing the shadow of 500 warriors lingering in memory. But it was not just fear that followed John. Something gentler had begun to grow as well. 2 days after the warriors departed, a small group of natives returned, not with weapons, but with gifts of food, herbs, and tools. Among them was the boy, Tahu, who ran to John's side as if to an uncle. His laughter filled the yard as he tugged John toward the horses, eager to show him the new carved toy his people had made. The boy's father, the chief, dismounted and spoke with John. "You are bound to us now," he said. "Not by blood, but by choice. Our people will visit, bring what you need. In turn, we will share knowledge of this land, its rivers, its seasons, its medicines. You will not live alone anymore." John was silent for a long moment. He had spent years believing that solitude was safer, easier, even necessary. Yet as he watched Tahu's small figure dart across the corral, he realized the boy had already filled the emptiness in his days. Perhaps companionship wasn't a burden. It was the thing he'd been starving for. That evening, as dusk painted, the plains gold, John sat on his porch with the chief beside him. They shared coffee from tin mugs, the bitter taste softened by the rare comfort of company. The chief spoke of his people's struggles, of treaties broken and promises shattered. John listened quietly, the fire of shame in his chest, reminding him of the cruelty his own kind often delivered. Finally, the chief said, "What you did for my son was small to you but great to us. You showed that not all white men's hearts are closed. For this, you are our kin." The word kin struck John harder than any bullet could. Kin, something he hadn't truly known since his parents had died, leaving him to drift across the frontier like tumbleweed. He cleared his throat, rough with emotion. "Kin," he repeated softly, tasting the word as though it were new. From then on, the ranch was no longer just a lonely patch of earth. Natives came and went, leaving food, teaching him how to read the wind for storms, how to find healing roots when sickness struck. In turn, John offered his tools, his spare shelter, and sometimes his rifle when game was scarce. A rhythm of trust began to weave between them. Even the townsfolk could not deny what they saw. The once isolated rancher now had allies who moved like shadows across the plains. When troublemakers muttered about driving John out, others warned them off. "That man's got 500 guardians," they whispered. And though John never spoke of it, he knew the promise was real. Should danger come, he would not face it alone. One evening, Tahu sat beside him on the porch, carving wood with a small knife. The boy looked up suddenly and asked, "Will you always be here, John? Will you always be my friend?" John ruffled the boy's hair with a rare smile. "As long as I'm breathing, lad. That's a promise." And in that moment, as the stars bloomed over the wide sky, John realized something profound. He had given shelter to a boy once. But it was the boy, and the bond that followed, that had truly given him shelter in return. Years rolled on, and with them the memory of that night when 500 warriors rode silently to John Mercer's ranch became legend. What had once been a simple act of sheltering a frightened boy had grown roots deeper than the strongest oak. It shaped not only John's life, but the way both settlers and natives spoke of the land they shared. John himself never thought of it as heroism. When asked, he would only shake his head and mutter, "I just did what any man ought to." But the truth was, few men would have chosen as he had. Fear made most people cruel. Compassion demanded courage. The feather gifted by the chief never left his side. He wore it tucked against his shirt during the day, and at night it rested on the peg by his bed. To him, it was not a token of honor, but a reminder, a weighty symbol that one life saved had rippled outward, changing the course of many. Children from both the nearby settlement and the native village began visiting the ranch more often, their laughter breaking the silence that had once been his prison. John taught them to ride horses, to mend fences, to care for animals. In return, they taught him songs of the earth, stories carried by wind and firelight. One afternoon, while repairing a corral post, John overheard two settlers speaking at the edge of his land. "Funny thing, isn't it?" one said. "A man like Mercer, quiet, strange, kept to himself. Now he's got more friends than any of us. Even the warriors call him kin." The other spat into the dirt but nodded. "Reckon it's 'cause he dared to do what we wouldn't. Maybe he's braver than the rest of us combined." John didn't interrupt, but their words stayed with him. Once he had been a shadow, dismissed by townfolk as little more than a bitter recluse. Now his name carried weight, not through wealth or violence, but through a single choice of kindness. Tahu, the boy he had once sheltered, grew tall and strong. He often visited John, sometimes staying weeks at a time. Together they rode the plains, hunted deer, and shared long talks by the fire. Where once had been a frightened child, now stood a young warrior, confident and wise beyond his years. One evening Tahu asked, "Do you ever regret it? Hiding me that night?" John chuckled, his weathered face softening. "Regret? No, lad. That was the first time in years I felt like I had a purpose. You gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost." Tahu nodded, understanding that John spoke not only of kinship, but of belonging. Seasons shifted, and with them came hardships, drought, sickness, disputes between settlers and tribes. Yet time and again, John found himself at the center, a bridge between two worlds. His voice carried weight with both sides, and more than once he prevented bloodshed with nothing more than calm words and the steady respect both groups held for him. By the time John's hair had silvered and his hands bore the stiffness of age, he was no longer seen as just a rancher. He was a symbol. Settlers told their children the story of the man who saved the boy, Natives passed down the tale of the stranger who became kin. Around campfires, his name was spoken not with suspicion, but with reverence. One late autumn evening, as the sky bled crimson over the horizon, John sat on his porch with Tahu, now a leader among his people. The younger man looked at him with quiet affection. "You may not see it, John," Tahu said, "but your choice that night, it changed more than you know. You saved me, yes, but you also planted trust where there had only been bitterness. You showed that men can see each other as brothers, not enemies." John gazed out across the golden plains, the wind carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter from both camps. His heart, once heavy with solitude, now brimmed with quiet peace. "I didn't set out to change the world," John murmured. "I only wanted to help a boy. And sometimes," Tahu replied gently, "that's all it takes." As the stars blossomed in the vast frontier sky, John felt the truth of those words settle deep inside him. His life was not marked by riches, nor by conquest, but by a single act of compassion that had echoed far beyond his years. And so, the legacy of John Mercer was written, not on stone or parchment, but in the lives he touched, the peace he helped nurture, and the unbroken bond of kinship between a rancher, a boy, and 500 warriors who once rode at dawn to stand in gratitude.